I recently read a really excellent piece of popular history, and I want to talk about it in this video today. So I'm going to talk about, in this video, this book, After the Prophet, the epic story of the Shiah-Sunni Split by Lesley Hazleton. This was published in 2009, and it's a really great, gripping history telling the story of how Shia and Sunni Islam first came to split, how that sort of schism in Islam happened. And it's a really great book. I'll just start with that. It's a really great read, a really gripping read. Lesley Hazleton is great at characterization, I think, especially, but a lot of other things. And I'm going to talk about a lot of the things that are great about this book, but I want to start with just, as best as I can, a broad summary of the events told in this book without necessarily giving away everything that happens in it, although, you know, it's history, so you can't exactly spoil history. But I don't want to tell everything that happens in it. But I do want to give a broad overview of the events told in this book. So like I said, this book is a history of how Shia and Sunni Islam first came to split. And that's a section of history that a lot of non-Muslim Westerners don't understand very well, don't really know anything about. And so what this split really goes back to is to who should have succeeded the Prophet Muhammad as the leader of the Islamic community after Muhammad died. And so, to give you a little bit of background, the Prophet Muhammad died without any biological sons. So he had no biological sons of his own. He had, I believe, a couple of daughters. The most famous child of Muhammad was Fatima, who I'm going to talk about a little bit more. But he had no biological sons. And so it wasn't entirely clear who was going to succeed him as the leader of the Islamic community. And a lot of people did believe at the time, and still believe to this day, that it should have been Muhammad's son-in-law, Ali, who took over after the Prophet. So Ali was married to Muhammad's daughter, Fatima. Ali and Fatima had had a handful of children, so Ali was the father of the Prophet's grandchildren. And he was one of the first people to adopt Islam, and he adopted Islam when he was fairly young. And he was just greatly admired as a person, and he still is revered, Ali is, in both Shia and Sunni Islam. But what happened historically, after Muhammad died, there was kind of a council of several men to confer on who should succeed the Prophet as the leader of the Islamic community. And so this was sort of a, you could say, quasi-democratic process where there was this gathering of a handful of men to discuss who should succeed the Prophet. And what was decided is that Abu Bakr should succeed the Prophet. Abu Bakr was actually the Prophet Muhammad's father-in-law. Muhammad married one of his daughters, so he was his father-in-law. And so you have a rule by Abu Bakr for a few years. Abu Bakr was already quite old when he took over as caliph, as they were called, successors to Muhammad. And then after Abu Bakr, Omar took over as caliph. And Omar was a very different animal from Abu Bakr. He was very much a warrior figure. And he led a lot of the Islamic conquest. And so he ruled over the Islamic world for a time. And then after Omar, a guy named Uthman took over, who also was somewhat close to the Prophet. And Uthman wasn't quite as effective of a caliph as Omar was. But then after Uthman died, then finally Ali was given his moment in the sun, so to speak, as caliph. But Ali's own rule as caliph was really short and really violent, due in large part to a guy named Muawiyah, who was also somewhat close to the Prophet Muhammad, but who was, to Shia Muslims, is a very devious figure because he basically brought about the downfall of Ali and also killed Ali's sons, or one of his sons, Hussein, and Aisha, who actually was a wife of the Prophet Muhammad, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about her. So Ali's own rule was short and brief, and he was succeeded by Muawiyah, who I again said kind of brought about Ali's downfall as caliph. And then, many years after Ali's death, his son Hussein endeavored to try to avenge his father against Muawiyah. But that didn't go well, and Hussein was brutally killed along with his family and many of his own soldiers. And so the main divide between Shia and Sunni Islam is over who was the proper leader of the Islamic community. To Shia Muslims, it was Ali, and it was always Ali. In Shia Islam, the caliphs aren't even recognized. So Abu Bakr, Omar, Uthman aren't even recognized as legitimate leaders of the Islamic community. They only recognize Ali. And to Shia Muslims, Ali is kind of their founding figure. As Lesley Hazleton puts it, he's kind of their founding figure. And then his younger son, Hussein, is kind of their Christ figure. Kind of Hussein, his life story is complete with this sort of passion narrative where he tries to avenge his father, but then is beaten quite horrifically by the forces of Muawiyah, and this is sort of a passion narrative that is actually told again and again every year in a lot of Shia Muslim communities. There are actually like passion plays, much like Christian communities have passion plays about Jesus Christ. And so to Shia Muslims, Ali was the proper successor to the leader, to Muhammad, and Ali was also the first imam, as he's called. So the first imam being kind of a term for the leader of the Muslim community. Right? And then his older son Hassan was the second imam, and Hussein was the third imam, and there have been other imams since then, but I'm not going to get into all that. To Sunni Muslims recognize the other caliphs in the leadership of Islam. So Abu Bakr, Omar, and Uthman, and Ali are referred to as the Rashidun, or the rightly guided caliphs. And so Ali is revered by both Sunni Muslims and Shia Muslims. But Shia Muslims do not look favorably on Muawiyah, for example, or some other leaders in the Islamic community. And so that's my attempt to kind of summarize the events told in this. So basically it's this story of a civil war in the Islamic community. This book is just great. I loved it so much. It was such a thrilling read. It's incredibly gripping, and it gains momentum as it goes. It gets more engrossing and suspenseful as it goes. I read the last 60 pages in one sitting, and it culminates in that passion narrative of the death of Hussein. And it's such a powerful passage in the book when she writes about the death of Hussein and the sort of mythology that's developed around what happened when Hussein dies. Another thing that Lesley Hazleton is so brilliant at is characterization. There are so many historical personages, historical people who are larger than life, who just leap off the page as real people. Right? People like Ali, of course, but also Aisha, one of the wives of the Prophet Muhammad. I'm going to talk a little bit more about her. Omar, Muawiyah himself, but also more minor figures. There are people in this narrative who only pop into the story for maybe a page or two, or even a paragraph or two, and they all feel fully realized. It honestly, to me, read a lot like Tolstoy in that way. I feel like Tolstoy is one thing that Tolstoy is brilliant at. He can delve really deeply into characters whose lives and desires and struggles he can explore for hundreds of pages. But he can also just create characters who only appear for one page and yet feel fully realized. Like they could leap right off the page and walk up and say hi to you, right? Even when they only appear for one page. And Lesley Hazleton does a very similar thing with her writing of history. And so just to give an example of that, one of the best drawn historical sort of characters in this book is Aisha. And Aisha is a fascinating individual for a number of reasons. So Aisha was, again, a wife of the Prophet Muhammad. Muhammad has had 9 wives in his life, I believe. And Aisha was known as the youngest. So if you've ever heard anyone who may possibly be somewhat Islamophobic point out that Muhammad married a 9-year-old girl or a 6-year-old girl and maybe didn't consummate the marriage until she was 9 or 12 or something, if you ever heard that talked about, often brought up by Islamophobic people who want to discredit the Prophet Muhammad and by extension the religion of Islam, this girl who they're talking about, whose name they usually don't know, is Aisha. That's Aisha. She claims to have married the Prophet when she was 6 and supposedly consummated the marriage when she was 9. Lesley Hazleton points out that it's unlikely that was actually true. It's likely that she made that up to make herself sound more special than Muhammad's other wives. But anyway, Aisha leaps out of these pages as a really fascinating and important historical personage. And what I really liked about learning more about Aisha is, again, she is so often brought up by Islamophobic people, again, to often discredit Muhammad as a child molester. And yet these people who bring this up rarely even know this girl's name, let alone anything else about her life. Aisha was an important political figure, as is shown in this book. She hangs over this entire book because after the Prophet died, she continued to be a really powerful force. But also she was a really important scholar. She actually was responsible for preserving a lot of the hadith about Muhammad. The hadith, I believe hadith translates as traditions. And these are kind of these short anecdotes or teachings from the Prophet's life that are supposed to offer further instruction to how to behave as a Muslim beyond the Quran, of course, with the Quran being the main canonical text. But she was responsible for preserving a lot of these hadith, these traditions, these stories and sayings of the Prophet. And so she's a really important source on the life of the Prophet Muhammad. So I find it really troubling how so many people use Aisha as a pawn in discrediting Muhammad, right? They seem to only really care about her insofar as she butted up against a powerful man in her life, right? But to get back to the point I originally wanted to make was Lesley Hazleton writes so strikingly about Aisha. And I'm going to read you the first long passage about Aisha in After the Prophet. So here it is. It was inconceivable to Aisha that her absence would not be noted, unthinkable that the caravan would not halt and a detachment be sent back to find her. As the Prophet's wife, she assumed a position of privilege. To expect her to catch up on foot was to expect her to behave like a normal teenage girl. And if there was one thing she would insist on all her life, it was her exceptionality. There was the age at which she had married Muhammad to start with. She had been a mere child, she later maintained, 6 years old when she was betrothed to him, and 9 years old when the marriage was celebrated and consummated. And though this was unlikely, few disputed her claim in her lifetime. Indeed, few people cared to dispute with her at all. As one of the most powerful caliphs would say many years later, there was never any subject I wished closed that she would not open, or that I wished open that she would not close. But if Aisha was indeed married so young, others would certainly have remarked on it at the time. In fact, most reports have her aged 9 when she was betrothed, and 12 when she was actually married, since custom dictated that girls not marry until puberty. But then again, to have been married at the customary age would have made Aisha normal, and that was the one thing she was always determined not to be. As she reminded everyone who would listen through to the end of her life, an enviably long one compared to the other main figures in this story, since she would outlive them all, she was not only Muhammad's youngest wife, but also the purest, the only one who had been neither a divorcee nor a widow, but a virgin at marriage. And most important of all, she was Muhammad's favorite. So you get that on Aisha, that kind of writing, that kind of characterization on Aisha, and many other people, both major and minor figures. You also get all sorts of interesting just insights into history and into Islam as well as the book goes along. One kind of notable example in particular where Lesley Hazleton takes some time to talk about how Islam has evolved a little bit in perhaps not the best way is with an anecdote that also involves Aisha. So at one point during Aisha's life, when the Prophet was still alive, she was accused of having committed adultery with another man, having slept with a man who was not her husband. And it kind of put the Prophet into a really difficult space because he didn't want to believe these rumors, but he also didn't know how to disprove them, right? And what saved the day was that the Prophet got a revelation, got one of his Quranic revelations. And the verses from the Quran that he got said that any accusation of adultery, in particular of sexual infidelity, any accusation of that must come with 4 eyewitnesses to the event itself, right? But that was really hard. That's really hard to produce. And no one was able to produce 4 witnesses to Aisha's supposed sexual infidelity. And so she was free to go. And another added piece of this Quranic revelation was that anyone who makes an accusation of adultery against someone else but can't produce the 4 witnesses themselves must be condemned for having slandered someone, right? And so when this verse was first revealed, it arguably did a very good thing, right? It helped a young woman who'd been falsely accused of adultery from being raked over the coals, right? And it was arguably a good thing for women in particular, right? But Lesley Hazleton writes about how this verse has been kind of twisted out of its original meaning, and how it, in many instances, has been used against women, in particular women who were victims of sexual assault. And so here's what she writes about that. Okay. Unless there were 4 witnesses to an illegal sexual act, it said, the Quranic verse said, the accused was blameless, and the false accusers were the ones to be punished. For a wronged woman, there could have been no better outcome, yet the form of it would be cruelly turned around and used by conservative clerics in centuries to come to do the opposite of what Muhammad had originally intended, not to exonerate a woman, but to blame her. The wording of his revelation would apply not only when adultery was suspected, but also when there had been an accusation of rape. Unless a woman could produce 4 witnesses to her rape, a virtual impossibility, she would be considered guilty of slander and adultery and punished accordingly. Aisha's exoneration was destined to become the basis for the silencing, humiliation, and even execution of countless women after her. So there are really interesting and occasionally troubling insights like that. And then, of course, there's a lot of overview of history, right? You learn a lot about history in this, naturally. I mean, it is a history book. But it's not just about the Sunni-Shia split. You also learn about things like the original Islamic conquests, right? Those original conquests when the Arabs newly converted to Islam left the Arabian Peninsula and spread out and conquered many places, right, from North Africa, expanding all the way to Spain, to all the way to the borders of India and into places like Afghanistan and that area. Right, there was this huge wave of Islamic conquests, and often these conquests are portrayed in the West as having been these really violent borderline holy wars. I've heard people claim that in these conquests, the Arab armies went around forcing people to convert, telling people basically if they didn't convert, they would kill them. And that's just not historically accurate. And in fact, a lot of the conquests themselves weren't violent. And Lesley Hazleton writes about this as well. So a lot of these conquests happened during the rule of the Caliph Omar. So she's starting there. All right. In the 10 years of Omar's rule, the Muslims took control of the whole of Syria and Iraq, an expansion so rapid that it is still often explained by, quote, a tribal imperative to conquest, unquote. The phrase is unknown to anthropologists, but it calls up an image of bloodthirsty peoples impelled by primitive urges, threatening the sane rationalism of the more civilized, the image incessantly echoed in current coverage of conflict in the Middle East. In fact, there was less blood involved than money. The Muslim forces did indeed win stunning military victories over the Persians and the Byzantines, despite being vastly outnumbered. But for the most part, the Arab conquest took place more by messenger than by the sword. Given the choice to accept Arab rule, albeit with the sword held in reserve, most of Islam's new subjects raised little objection. The Arabs, after all, were no strangers. Long before Muhammad's ascent to power, Meccan aristocrats had owned estates in Egypt, mansions in Damascus, farms in Palestine, date orchards in Iraq. They had put down roots in the lands and cities they traded with, for to be a trader in the 7th century was to be a traveler, and to be a traveler was to be a sojourner. The twice-yearly Meccan caravans to Damascus, up to 4,000 camels at a time, did not merely stop and go at that great oasis. They stayed for months at a time while contacts were made, negotiations carried out, hospitality extended and provided. Arabian traders had long been part and parcel of the social, cultural, and economic life of the lands they were to conquer. So, that's really interesting. I didn't necessarily even know that. I knew a fair amount about Islamic history, but I didn't necessarily know that a lot of these conquests weren't even directly violent. And then along the way too, and this is kind of the last point that I'll make, I really love the kind of cultural insights you get in this book as well. Lesley Hazleton is really good on just the culture of the time. And one passage that really brought this out to me and that I thought was really lovely was where she writes about satire and the importance of, in particular, satirical poetry in Arabia at the time, and still in the Islamic world. And she's writing about this in the context of Muawiyah trying to put together a kind of propaganda campaign against Ali to kind of justify Muawiyah's own war on Ali. And she writes about how his first line of attack, quote unquote, was poetry. So I'll read to you about that. All right. The first line of attack in this campaign was poetry. This is certainly a strange idea in the modern West, where poets are so easily ignored. But in the 7th century Middle East, poets were stars, especially satirical poets, whose work was endlessly quoted and chanted. It was written not to be read, but to be memorized and repeated, to make the rounds not of literary salons, but of the streets and the alleys, the marketplace and the mosque. The more cutting the verses and the sharper the barbs, the more popular and irresistibly repeatable they were, and the more renowned their creators. They were taken with sometimes deadly seriousness. When one popular poet opposed Muhammad's ascent to the leadership of Medina, quote, "Men of Medina, will you be cuckold, allowing this stranger to take over your nest," unquote, she had taunted. She had received a sword through her heart in the dead of night for her pains. Word spread as quickly as her poems had, and other Medinan wordsmiths who had been critical of Muhammad quickly began turning out verses in his praise. In the 21st century, Westerners shocked at the scope of Muslim reaction to Danish cartoons of Muhammad seemed to conclude that there is no tradition of satire in Islam. On the contrary, there is a strongly defined tradition, and one clearly linked to warfare. In the 7th century, satire was a potent weapon, and it is still seen that way. Salman Rushdie's novel The Satanic Verses created such a stir in the Islamic world because it was an extraordinarily well-informed satire. By playing on Quranic verses and on hadith reports of Muhammad's life, Rushdie cut close to the bone. While satire may be thought relatively harmless in the West, at its best cutting-edge humor, but the cut only a figurative one, in Islam the cut is far more literal. When they are the first weapon in war, words draw blood. So, I hope that gives you a good idea of the writing in this. It's really sharply written. It's a pleasure to read. Lesley Hazleton clearly knows her stuff, but she wears her learning very lightly. When you're writing about this era of history, you have to juggle a lot of different sources and a lot of different conflicting reports, and she does it seamlessly. And yeah, I don't know. I feel like I can't really recommend this highly enough. It was a really just brilliant, gripping read of history. It's very short. You can probably read it in a week. I did. Lesley Hazleton has also written a biography of the Prophet Muhammad, which I am now dying to read, because if it's anything like this, it will be pretty awesome. So anyway, that's what I have to say about After the Prophet by Lesley Hazleton. If you've read it, love to hear your thoughts. If you haven't read it and just are interested in the historical period, really interested to hear your thoughts as well. But anyway, I think that's about all I have to say. So I will leave it at that, and talk to you all in my next video. All right?